Welcome to our special service. My name is Kate Heilig. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm happy to be your worship leader today. As we begin our service, I invite you to silence your phones, close other windows on your computer, take a deep breath, and center yourself for worship. We open and welcome to the ancestral people of this land, acknowledging that our church, like all of Burke, rests on the unceded territory of the Manahoac tribe of the Great Sioux Nation. We seek healing and the realization of justice with the people of this land who live on and their descendants, the present-day members of the Monacan Indian Nation, the Patawomic Indian Tribe of Virginia, and the Piscataway Indian Nation. We honor the ancestors as we move toward healing so that all together shall one day know full justice. As we light our chalice, please join in reciting these words. Together we care in community. Together we grow in spirit. Together we act for justice.
Welcome to Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm Warren McLean. I'm your worship associate this morning. This congregation is a welcoming and inclusive spiritual home where we inspire each other to live our values. Together we care in community, grow in spirit, and act for justice. I hope you got a name tag or have your name in the Zoom name tag. If you need help with that, let us know in the chat. Whether you're a longtime member or a newcomer, or something in between, we encourage you to stay here for our social hour, online and in person, immediately after the service. We're so delighted that you could be here this morning. Welcome.
So today is a special service. We are usually led by our minister, Reverend William Levewood, but today, the Racial Justice Committee and True Accotink Colors have worked together to bring you reflections and stories about two important events in our history. Juneteenth and Stonewall can be delicate things to discuss, but should be talked about, and should be talked about with respect and reverence. Today, we hope to do just that, honoring the people who lived through these events and celebrating the journey that has led us to the present day. Welcome to the service. Our Time for All Ages brings us two books. The first book, The Night Before Freedom, A Juneteenth Story. Is Grandma going to tell the story? I asked Dad, as the last float in the parade passed by. She sure is, said Dad. It wouldn't be Juneteenth if she didn't. We had come to celebrate Juneteenth. After a day of parades and speeches, food and music, it was time to remember June 19th, 1865. The day news of the Emancipation Proclamation arrived in Galveston. My family had gathered at Grandma's house, where aunts, uncles, and cousins were waiting for her to tell the story of the first Juneteenth, when her grandmother, Mom Bess, was only 6 years old. Grandma still remembered the story just the way Mom Bess used to tell it. When Grandma eased into her rocking chair, we knew it was time. We kids rushed over to sit on the floor around her. Everyone, young and old, hushed as Grandma got a faraway look in her eyes and began. On the night before freedom, joy flowed from each mouth as hints of freedom spread throughout the South. Freedom was something that I'd never seen. I wondered, what would it look like and what would it mean? A rainbow, said some, would appear sea to sea, and then we'd sprout wings and we'd all fly away free. The very next day was the 19th of June, the day freedom arrived from a bugle horn tune. It came on a horse, just as simple as that. A stranger approached with the tip of his hat. "Hear ye," he cried, and we knew right away. Somehow we knew that today was the day. At first, I stood still as the man slowly read. Then I trembled with joy at each word that he said. People of Texas, by this proclamation, you are hereby informed of your emancipation. This involves absolute equality. You are now henceforth forward and forever free. As the man on the horse read the words on the scroll, a burden seemed lifted from each tired soul. I heard singing and shouting and cries of, "We're free." There was hugging and dancing, a true sight to see. Papa swept Mama right off her feet, then spun me around as my heart skipped a beat. But no rainbows appeared. No one took to the sky. I could not understand, so I asked Mama why. "Bess," Mama said, smiling, "we're not taking flight. Freedom means claiming our God-given right to work for ourselves and to learn and to play, to own our own land and to have our own say." Papa kept plowing the red Texas clay. He worked hard as ever, but now received pay. We bought our own land, and as our family grew, in good times and bad times, our love saw us through. We enjoyed all the things that true liberty brings. I learned reading and writing, and that gave me wings. I still see the dancing, the hugging, the tears, but now, in my mind's eye, a rainbow appears. Bess grew up a writer, wrote words simple and clear to tell other people what made freedom so dear. Words spanning a rainbow for all to see. We are now, henceforward, and forever free. On the night before Pride, a warm evening in June, all the people get ready with the rise of the moon. All across the city, people's outfits were planned and instruments polished for the queer marching band. As I finished my sign, which I laid on the floor, I remembered the prides I'd been to before. All day we will walk in the streets up and down. Pride's one of the best celebrations around. There are floats and loud music and rainbows and glitter. Last year, we even saw our babysitter. Tomorrow will be baby Sammy's first Pride. Can we tell the whole story? I hopefully cried. So we sat on the couch, a mom on each side, and took turns telling the tale of the very first Pride. A long time ago, in 1969, there wasn't a Pride March. It was not a fair time. Queer people all over, of each shape and size, did not have their rights recognized. So much of their lives they had to keep hidden. Even their clothing was sometimes forbidden. Stonewall was a place where it was safe to be proud, but police would storm in and say this wasn't allowed. So one hot night in June, people stopped being quiet. They decided to fight and started a riot. More and more gathered to fight back in the heat. Some started a kick line in the middle of the street. Police broke up the crowd night after night, but the people stood strong, knowing this wasn't right. And so it began, a march that spread worldwide to show everyone it's good to have pride. It sometimes happens that we're not given respect. It can take a long time for some to accept. That's why every year we all get together and march in the streets, no matter the weather. To show that we matter, to show we all exist, and that any oppression we must always resist. So pride's not just about tutus and rainbow suspenders. It's about rights for queers and all of our beautiful genders. Pride's a day that is crowded. It's a day that is long. But it's a day that we say, together we're strong.
During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln gave a speech at the dedication of a cemetery at Gettysburg for the fallen Union soldiers. He said, "It's good to dedicate this cemetery, but there is a higher calling for us." He said, and I quote, "We here highly resolve that these dead shall have not died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom." When President Lincoln said this, he was counting two births of freedom, one in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, and the new birth of freedom, the abolition of slavery. The Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation accomplished that abolition, but the news spread slowly. On June 19, 1865, the enslaved black people in Galveston, Texas, finally heard the news that slavery was over. What did freedom mean to the enslaved black people at this time? They were free to form families and enjoy them because enslavers can't sell their spouses and their children to faraway places where they'll never see them again. They were free to move away with their family if they didn't like their current job. They were free to be able to protect their spouses and daughters from sexual predators. They were free to make a better life for their children. They were free to enjoy life without the constant threat of whipping and another inhumane and sadistic punishments anytime their enslaver feels like it. They were free to educate themselves and rise in the world. They were free to demand justice in court and to testify in court. They were free to vote and run for office. When the Union General told people in Galveston that they were free, they had every right to expect these 9 freedoms to be theirs. And it would be truly wonderful if the story ended happily here. But unfortunately, history tells us otherwise. Indeed, a full century after the Emancipation Proclamation, Dr. Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. He called the Declaration of Independence a promissory note. He said, 50 years ago, a great American signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on the promissory note that all people, black as well as white, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For about 12 years after the Civil War, in the period called Reconstruction, Black people were largely free. Free public school systems were established in the South for the first time. Taxation was more equitable, and many forms of racial discrimination were outlawed. Black people even won election to Southern state governments and to the US Congress. But then the forces of reaction and white supremacy set in and tried as much as possible to deny the 9 freedoms. What followed were many years that saw injustice and tragedy. From economic injustices of sharecropping and segregation to the political injustice of poll taxes and other methods to deny Black citizens the right to vote. And we must also remember the many racially motivated violent crimes committed against individuals and even against whole communities. We remember them and speak some of their names. We remember the Greenwood community and the Tulsa massacre of 1921. We remember the horrible crimes committed against Recy Taylor and Emmett Till and many others. We remember the 4 little girls who perished in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham: Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Carol Denise McClare. We remember the martyrs of the Civil Rights Movement. And yes, we remember the recent deaths of Sandra Bland, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. But despite these tragedies, despite the injustice, the descendants of this newly freed people would also triumph. Excluded from white schools, they formed their own institutions, like the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama that supported scientific geniuses like George Washington Carver that we heard about last Sunday. Like Hampton Agricultural and Industrial School, now called Hampton University, right here in Virginia, and Howard University in Washington, D.C. These schools and many more were all founded within 20 years of the end of the Civil War. Black people created organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People that would be pivotal in resisting racist oppression, and that would produce leaders like Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall represented the plaintiffs in Brown versus the Board of Education, a 1954 Supreme Court decision that outlawed separate schools. Marshall would go on to become the first Black justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. This newly freed people and their heirs also created fantastic artistic expressions, ones that ever proclaimed that Black lives matter. Black people gave America most of its new forms of music, from the sorrow songs of the enslaved to gospel music, and then ragtime, blues, and jazz, which has been described as the classical music of the whole nation. And later, yes, even rock and roll. They also gave us Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and the Harlem Renaissance. They gave us Ralph Ellison and James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry and August Wilson. They gave us Toni Morrison, a graduate of Howard University and one of the greatest literary voices of our nation, and the amazing eloquence and quiet dignity of Martin Luther King, Jr. We can name many other gifts they have given to our society and to the world. From Alvin Ailey, Muhammad Ali, Jesse Norman, to Ava DuVernay, Serena Williams, and Barry Jenkins. The descendants of the formerly enslaved would persevere again and again and again. From generation to generation, the rebirth of freedom would be renewed. And again, they would exemplify these lines from Maya Angelou's poem, "Still I Rise." Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream, and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. Beloveds, Juneteenth is a day that has been set aside for the nation both to remember and to celebrate this legacy, this quintessentially American heritage, to reflect both on how far we have come. We live when Black people can be president, and to reflect on how far we still have to go to fulfill the promises of freedom for everyone.
The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Lower Manhattan in New York City. Like many of the gay bars during this time, it was owned by the mafia, which used its connections to pay bribes to the police. During a time of high discrimination, it became a haven for people in the LGBTQ+ community, especially for people of color. The Stonewall Inn and places like it allowed people to come out of their own proverbial closets and find others who would accept them. Think about being in that place and having a haven where you could be yourself. However, the police often did raids or sweeps of neighborhood parks and bars of gay people to make sure that the clothes people wore matched their assigned genders and to discourage any homosexual behavior. Just imagine the police stopping you to make sure that you had on at least 3 items of clothing that they felt were okay for the gender marked on your ID card. Today we honor what has been called the Stonewall Riots, Stonewall Uprising, Stonewall Rebellion, or simply just Stonewall, which was the response to a police raid which occurred on June 28, 1969. Raids occurred about once a month at the Stonewall Inn, but this time was different. This time, patrons refused to show their IDs. They refused to go with the police. They had had enough. When most of the patrons had been physically kicked out of the bar, a crowd formed outside. Things escalated and a fire started inside the bar. Notable African-American street queen, Marsha P. Johnson, even made her way to the crowd. As one Stonewall patron remembers, we all had a collective feeling like we had just had enough of this kind of stuff. It wasn't anything tangible anybody said to anyone else. It was just kind of like everything over the years had come to a head on that one particular night in the one particular place. And it was not an organized demonstration. Everyone in the crowd felt that we were never going to go back. It was like the last straw. It was time to reclaim something that had always been taken from us. All kinds of people, all different reasons, but mostly it was total outrage, anger, sorrow, everything combined, and everything just kind of ran its course. It was the police who were doing most of the destruction. We were really trying to get back in and break free. And we felt that we had freedom at last, or freedom to at least show that we demanded freedom. And we weren't going to be walking meekly into that night and letting them shove us around. It's like standing your ground for the first time and in a really strong way. And that's what caught the police by surprise. There was something in the air, freedom, a long time overdue, and we're going to fight for it. The bottom line was we weren't going to go away, and we didn't. The riots would continue for 2 nights. The Stonewall riots gave way to a revolution. The Gay Liberation Front, or GLF, was formed, the first group to actively use the word gay in their name instead of an obscure hint of the word. Then the Gay Activist Alliance, GAA, came next. Their constitution began, quote, "We as liberated homosexual activists demand the freedom for expression of our dignity and values as human beings. Many publications came out, like the newspaper Gay, Come Out, and Gay Power. Joan Nessel co-founded the Lesbian Herstory Archives in 1974 and credits, quote, its creation to that night and the courage that found its voice in the streets. On the one-year anniversary of the Stonewall riots, another crowd came together on Christopher Street. This time, it was for Pride and was known as the first Pride Parade, also occurring in LA and Chicago. The march in New York covered 51 blocks from Christopher Street to Central Park. Reporting by the Village Voice described the march as, quote, the out-front resistance that grew out of the police raid on the Stonewall Inn 1 year ago. Although the Stonewall Inn only lasted a few months after the riot, its legacy lives on. Sociologist Elizabeth A. Armstrong says of the Stonewall riots that, quote, it is marked by an international commemorative ritual, an annual gay pride parade. Within 2 years, there were pride parades in many more U.S. cities, and there were gay rights groups in every major American city, Canada, Australia, and Western Europe. Historian Nicholas Edsall writes, Stonewall has been compared to any number of acts of radical protest and defiance in American history, from the Boston Tea Party on. But the best, and certainly a more nearly contemporary analogy, is with Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama in December 1955, which sparked the modern civil rights movement. Within months after Stonewall, radical gay liberation groups and newsletters sprang up in cities and on college campuses across America, and then across all of Northern Europe as well. In 1999, the U.S. Department of the Interior entered the location of the Stonewall Inn into the National Register of Historic Places. In a dedication ceremony, Assistant Secretary of the Department of the Interior, John Berry, stated, quote, let it forever be remembered that here, on this spot, men and women stood proud. They stood fast so that we may be who we are. We may work where we will, live where we choose, and love whom our hearts desire. June 28, 2018, 49 years after the uprising, Stonewall Day was announced as a commemoration day. President Barack Obama even referenced Stonewall in his second inaugural address in 2013, saying, we, the people, declare today that the most evidence of truth, that all of us are created equal, is a star that guides us still, just as it guided our forebears through Seneca Falls, and Selma and Stonewall. Our journey is not complete until our gay brothers and sisters are treated like anyone else under the law. For if we are truly created equal, then surely the love we commit to one another must be equal as well.
We are celebrating, yes, we are celebrating how far we have come toward racial and LGBTQ equality. Hopefully you noticed I used the word toward, because although we have come a long way, we certainly have not arrived yet. John talked about Juneteenth, which is a celebration of when the last enslaved people in Texas actually became free when the Emancipation Proclamation was finally enforced there. John also quoted Dr. King's 1963 I Have a Dream speech, where he said that America has defaulted on the promissory note that all people would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Mary and I can bear personal witness to that default. I was born and grew up in Mississippi in 1940s through the 1970s. And if any of you saw the MSNBC special on Lowndes County, that's exactly like where I lived and grew up. Mary's grandfather served on a county school board for years, and when he tried to put some more money into the school budget to increase parity for black schools, he was visited by the Ku Klux Klan and told to stop. And if he didn't stop, they would get him off the board. Well, Denny didn't stop, and they did get him off the board. In the early 70s, Mary was driving home from our recently integrated university with a fellow black student when, after stopping for gas, she was followed for many miles by the highway patrol. She was finally stopped. She was asked to show her identification, and then it was suggested to her that she might consider who it is she's riding with. That would not happen now, and we should celebrate that fact. Dr. King also said in that 1963 speech that 1963 is not an end, but it is a beginning, and it was a beginning. Because of the March on Washington and the assassination of President Kennedy, President Johnson was able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was a landmark piece of legislation that banned labor discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and also ended racial segregation in public facilities, public education, and federally funded programs. Following Bloody Sunday in April of 1965, President Johnson was able to pass the Voting Rights Act, which addressed the tools that states had developed to prevent African Americans from voting, things like the grandfather clause, poll taxes, and literacy tests. And then finally, a week after the assassination of Dr. King, the Fair Housing Act was signed into law, which banned discrimination in public housing. This was a lot of legislative progress in a relatively short period of time. Similarly, Kate told you the story of Stonewall and what it sparked. You know, when I grew up in Mississippi, there were no LGBTQ people. At least they didn't exist, or at least not openly. They were not allowed to be open. Now, there are gay pride parades at the University of Mississippi and at Mississippi State University. How times have changed, and we should celebrate that. Since Stonewall, we've made a lot of progress. In 1979, the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights brought an estimated 200,000 people to the Capitol. And in 1987, the second National March had an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 attendees, and in 1993, another 800,000 to 1 million people participated. And the country started to listen. In 2000, Vermont became the first state to recognize civil unions between same-sex partners. In 2003, the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that preventing gays and lesbians from marrying violated the state constitution. Between 2009 and 11, many more states legalized same-sex marriage, and in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that bans on same-sex marriage violated the 14th Amendment. As Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This has been true for both the civil rights and the LGBTQ rights movements, and we should celebrate that fact. But bends is the operative word, and we can't become complacent. And we can't for two reasons. First, although things are so much better than they were, we still haven't arrived. Black maternal mortality is still 2.6 times higher than for whites. Since the Supreme Court ruled racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, educational gaps have narrowed by 40%, but remain large. Life expectancy gaps between white Americans and people of color have begun to narrow, but inequities still exist. And although the imprisonment rate among black Americans has fallen by over a third since 2006, black Americans remain far more likely to be in prison than white Americans, and frequently for the same violation. And second, as we have seen in the past several years, there is a lot of pushback to the progress that we have made. Some states are taking actions that make it harder for people of color to vote. They're passing very strong anti-choice legislation. They're curtailing gay and especially trans rights. And they are sharply limiting what children can learn about our racial history and about sexual orientation. And so we should celebrate how far we have come, how much better things are today than they were even 20 years ago. But we can't become complacent. And one of the many things I love about this congregation is that we are not complacent. We advocate. We advocate at the federal, state, and local levels by writing letters to and emails to and meeting with our legislators, by attending school board and zoning board meetings, and witnessing at Black Lives Matter, immigration, and poor people campaign rallies. We have done this in the past, we do it today, and we must continue to do it in the future. We must do that so we can make Dr. King's words come true. I have a dream. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And if America is to be a great nation, this dream must become true. And when it does, and when we allow freedom to ring from every state and every city, we will speed up that day when all of God's children, black and white, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, gay and cisgender, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. It is up to us to take action and to lift our voices so that we are heard.
Okay, so now that we've been nourished and nurtured in this welcoming and inclusive spiritual home, let us go out inspired to share our values in this world. Happy Sunday, everyone.